This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzanotes, and it's Saturday, and that means it's time for Nizzanotes, my weekly vlog series where I talk about limited magic. We're still only a few weeks into Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, a format that is incredibly complex, and I think, in this early stage at least, I think it's one of the best limited formats we've ever seen, and in general, there's been a pretty good feedback about the format. I ran a poll just because I was curious how people were feeling, and most people thought it was either one of the best formats ever or a really good format, and that's a pretty good sign. And part of the reason for that is complexity. Part of the reason for that is that it's a fairly balanced format. Most of the colors, all the colors, and most of the archetypes are pretty viable. You can do all kinds of things in the format, from aggro decks to slow, grindy ones. There's just a lot of replay value. Limited Magic always has that, but this really has it. But because it's so complex, there's probably going to be a lot to talk about as we move forward with Nizzanotes during Neon Dynasty season. And today I wanted to talk about 10 cards that are underperforming. Last week I looked at some overperformers, and this one I want to talk about 10 cards that are worse than I expected. Talk about why it is they're worse. It relates to various things going on in this format. We'll do a crack-a-pack as well at the end. So let's just go ahead and jump into talking about these 10 cards that are performing worse than I expected. So the very first of these is Tonios Completion. So, every time we get a blue aura removal spell, it seems like it underperforms. I always am finally like, look, this is one that'll be good. And, this one's not bad. It's just not premium. It's not something, I give it a B- in the set review, and it's probably more like a C+. It's not a major underperformance, but it's not an insignificant one. And the reason I thought it would be good is because it not only taps the creature down, it shuts off all of its abilities, and that's great. The problem is that any removal that costs, that's just sort of a 1-for-1 trade that costs more than like 2 mana in this format, can be kind of a liability. There are so many cards in this format that give your opponent value before you remove it. For example, using this to shut down a saga creature doesn't feel great. There's a lot going on in the format that makes any sort of kind of expensive removal spell, and by expensive I mean like costing 4 or more, makes it a lot worse. And that's true for Tonios Completion. It's not true of all the more expensive removal out there. For example, the 2 generic 2 black removal spell that you put on a creature, it gets +1/+1, and it kills a thing. That's not quite the same because it does so much other stuff, interacting with enchantment stuff, as well as pumping your creature. So it's not true for all of them, but it is kind of true of Completion. You're still going to play it. It's removal. You need removal. But it is less good than I expected. Next up, I want to talk about Mobiliser Mech. So I thought this was going to be like really good. And in general, at the beginning of this video, I said of the 10, all the 10 archetypes are pretty viable. There are 2 that I think are a little less viable, and one of them is the blue-white vehicle deck. And that's just because it's hard to jam a bunch of vehicles into your deck. You need a certain number of creatures to crew those vehicles, and so there's a weird tension going on there. And so Mobiliser Mech, I envisioned frequently getting crewed and then turning on another vehicle and then going crazy. And it does that. It just does it a lot less frequently than I expected. Partly because that deck is not as good as I expected. Doesn't really work super consistently. The vehicles in general in the set, there's lots of playable ones. But if you're not in the blue-white deck, you usually end up with like 1 to 2 vehicles, and Mobiliser Mech's not going to be one of them that you want to play because you aren't going to be able to take advantage of its effect. So Mobiliser Mech, it is still pretty good. I mean, it's a nice card. It's just not great like I expected. Next, there's Mech Hanger, which is related. I thought this would be really sweet and give you a lot of value by crewing your vehicles, and it does that. But for reasons I just mentioned with Mobiliser Mech, it happens a lot less often than I would like. And in a lot of decks, it ends up not being worth the damage it does to your mana base to put it into your deck, because you're putting a card in your deck that only produces colorless mana, or mostly produces colorless mana, and that's just not worth it for an effect that is, sure, it's upside, but it's not worth the upside if you're only doing it like once every 5 games, and that's what it ends up doing. There's still times you play it, certainly, but it is not as good as I thought it would be. Not this like great value land that I expected. Next up, there's Explosive Entry. So this format has a lot of artifacts, and for that reason, I thought Explosive Entry would be something you end up playing a lot. The +1/+1 counter plus destroy an artifact is great. But in the end, generally speaking, enchantment removal is where it's at in this format. And there are a bunch of cards in this format. They're not in red, of course, but there are cards in this format that destroy artifacts or enchantments. And those are just so much better than this. I mean, yeah, running one of these is fine, but you're often going to find yourself cutting it. This format is so deep in terms of playables that you're just going to end up cutting Explosive Entry from a lot of your decks. It's hard to find a slot for it in a lot of decks because it's sort of like, well, it's going to have targets, but it's still sort of narrow removal. I'd rather run like a good 2-drop over it or a different removal spell over it. It's not bad, but I thought it was going to be something you like always were excited to have one of in your red decks, and that's just not the case. You end up cutting it about as often as you end up playing it. Next up, there's Kami of Reckless Shadows. This one is one that, I gave a build around grade 2 in the set review, and I didn't think it was a great build around. I gave it like a C if you're in the ninja deck. But it has disappointed even from there. And a lot of people, not a lot of people, but some people in the comments were telling me that it was going to be worse, and I didn't think they were right, but obviously they were. Generally, even in your ninja deck, where this can frequently get you something back, the effect is still narrow enough, and the body this gives you is still underwhelming enough that it's really not that great. I mean, you end up cutting this from a lot of your ninja decks because you'd rather have more like flyers to enable your ninjutsu or more ninjas than you'd want to have something like this. Plus, if there are things you want to get back from your graveyard, there's a lot of better ways to do it in this format than Kami of Reckless Shadows. Next up, there's 2 cards I want to talk about together. They're Uprising Renegade and Heir of the Ancient Fang. So the other deck, I mentioned blue-white as being the one that has been kind of underwhelming. If you have to put 2 at the bottom, one of them is blue-white, and I think the other one's red-green. The red-green signpost uncommon's great, but this sort of modification strategy, in a lot of ways, flies in the face of a lot of the rest of the format, where you're sort of wanting to add stuff to a bunch of your creatures instead of just like playing sagas and getting crazy value. And that's sort of the central thing in this format, really, is playing sagas. And I've envisioned these 2 being like part of a really sweet curve out where you play like the 1-mana 1/1 with a counter, then you play Uprising Renegade, then you play Heir of the Ancient Fang, and you just go to town. And it happens. The red-green deck's not unplayable. I'm just saying that both of these cards as modification payoffs have overall been underwhelming. And I thought both of them would be sort of key cards for that deck, but, it turns out these both are so mediocre when you don't have your stuff going on with modifications, and then the upside they give you when you do is nice, but it's nothing special, and you'd rather just have, like, good creatures to put counters on, like with the signpost uncommon and stuff like that are good in a wider variety of situations, because most red-green decks just don't end up with like enough modification synergy to really make these 2 cards great. I'm not saying they're bad. Both of them are perfectly playable, and the red-green deck is too. I just expected these both to be better than they've turned out to be. Next up, I've got Unstoppable Ogre. This card is, again, this isn't one that's like bad. We haven't really on this list, the only card that I would say that you end up cutting more often than you play it so far is Mobiliser, or rather Mech Hanger. Like, that one has been a complete dud. Most of the rest of these have just been downgraded. They're not bad, actively bad. There aren't a lot of actively bad cards in limited Magic these days, and so none of these are, and the Ogre's not. But anything that has 1 toughness and costs a significant amount of mana is extra bad in this format. There's just so many cheap value ways to kill it. There's the Umezawa Saga, for example. There's the aura that gives -1/-1. There's just all of these effects that very efficiently kill X1s, and that makes something like the Ogre a bit of a bummer. It is nice that it's an artifact and that it does something when it enters the battlefield. Those 2 things still make it, a solid card, especially if you're in like an aggressive artifact type deck, which is definitely a thing. But it has been a little less good than I expected, just because you end up getting sort of blown out when your opponent blows it up. And that's true of any of the X1s in the format that cost significant mana, but this is one that really stood out to me. Next up, there is Web Spinner Cuff. this is a perfectly fine card. It's hard to get unplayables these days, but I thought this would be the kind of thing that you're kind of, feel pretty good about having one of in most of your green decks. At worst, it's a 1/4 reach, and then you can move it around. And most of the things that have reconfigure have turned out to be pretty good, which is what I expected, in the set review. But this has not really turned out to be the case with this card. And it's not really, if you put this card in a lot of sets, it would probably be better. The main problem it has is that it's an artifact and the one color in the set that really doesn't care about artifacts, like, at all. I guess white doesn't care either, but there just aren't that many green decks that care that this is an artifact. And in fact, most green decks want to be jamming as many enchantments as they can into the deck. And there's only so many slots in your deck that you want to be taking up, especially with permanents that aren't enchantments, because the payoffs for enchantment stuff are so great. And Web Spinner Cuff just doesn't check that box. And you just don't find yourself in need of this 1/4 reach all that often. You'll play it, but you probably, if you're in like the green-white deck or the black-white deck, or black-green deck rather, you probably are hoping for more enchantments and more cards that give you some actual synergy than you are counting on this thing that is mostly just a French vanilla creature. And that's not really, synergy is big in this format, and the cuff is sort of in a no man's land when it comes to that. And lastly, there's Unforgiving one. I figured it would be hard to really get this thing going, to really actually be reanimating things. And that's been true, but what I kind of thought is that the fact it was a 3-mana 2/3 with Menace would do enough to make it so that this was a nice playable that had some upside. But you end up just not playing it in a lot of black decks. For one thing, black decks aren't great at modifications, so it's kind of an awkward card in that sense. Red and green are the colors that are sort of filled with modification stuff. And black, it has it. You can do things with it, but a lot of them are not very good, like the giant energy sword or whatever. You just don't want to be running most of the cards that are modifications in black. So Unforgiving one ends up basically just being a 3-mana 2/3 menace. And while that's sort of an okay baseline in a format like this one, where synergy is really king, there's, if this happened to be an enchantment or something, that would make it way better in this format, or an artifact too. But it's neither, and so it just ends up being like a mediocre French vanilla creature, much like Web Spinner Cuff, where you don't really get the upside out of it often enough to really ever be excited about playing it in your black decks. So those are 10 cards that I've been disappointed with, that have underperformed from what I expected. Let's move now into the Crack-A-Pack, where I'm going to, show you a pack one, pick one scenario, talk about all the cards in the pack. It also gives me an opportunity to sort of more generally talk about my thoughts in the format. So let's check that out. All right, so here is our pack. So Dismal Backwater is our first common. It's a gain land. You never want to first pick one of these, but they are something you shouldn't undervalue. This format actually has significant fixing. Playing the Kami War is pretty legit. But there's other reasons to be splashing too, and the 10 gain lands being in the set at common is a big part of that. And so you should value them, above, right around where you value like an average card, I'd say, in the early going of the draft. And then once you're really interested in splashing a bomb or something, they obviously move up in your pick order, but you're never first picking one. Next up is Tales of Master Sushiro. So, like I said, sagas are a big game in this format. In Strixhaven, it sort of felt like if you didn't end up in a deck that was good at learning and grabbing cards out of your sideboard and getting that value, you felt like you were at a serious disadvantage if you didn't have a significant amount of that going on. And I'd say the same is true about sagas in this format. If you're not in on a couple of sagas at least, you're kind of at a disadvantage because you don't have these sort of value engine enchantments that give you some nice effects and then give you a very efficient creature. Your opponent's just going to be able to use their mana a lot more efficiently than you are. And so basically all the sagas in the set are pretty good, or at least, are cards that playing one of is pretty likely, and you're probably not cutting it. There are some exceptions, especially at rare, like the egg one, and the red threaten one at common isn't very good either, but most of them pretty good, and you kind of actively want them. And Tales of Master Sushiro is a nice one. It's one that can really close out a game. It enhances one of your creatures 2 turns in a row and then gives you a huge creature that can just rumble right away. And it's a card I feel good about first picking, at least in some weaker packs. The Modern Age, another saga. This one also is pretty good. I don't think it's as good as the Tales of Master Sushiro, but it does allow you to, you get to loot a couple of times and then you get an efficient flyer. It gets better if you combine it with the construct to like exile. When you discard things, they get exiled and you can play them. That card has turned out to be pretty real if you have the right pieces to go around it. The Modern Age is one of those. And yeah, it's not as good as Tales of Master Sushiro. I would still take the Tales, but the Modern Age also pretty good. Short Circuit, this isn't so good. It's very ineffective removal. Basically, you'll play it if you're really short on removal. But it has a few weird things going on, namely that the big thing, and it's not that weird, I guess, is just that it doesn't do enough to downgrade mini creatures. Just lowering a creature's power and taking away flying, not really worth the card these days with the kinds of things that creatures can do. Your opponent probably either already got some kind of value out of the card, or it has some sort of activated ability that it can still use, and that's a problem. It is an enchantment, but blue barely cares about that, so it's not really a big bonus there. So it's not a card I love. It's really a card that you don't play very often. Grafted Growth. This is a decent piece of fixing. You don't run it in every deck, I don't think, but it is another card, especially if you're base green, that enables you to be like very easily play 3 colors and, sometimes play 4 or 5 colors. Something like Grafted Growth can help you do that. The counter it gives you is a big deal because it comes down and actually impacts the board in addition to, making stuff happen with your lands. There's also various enchantment synergies that it triggers in green that are pretty nice. That said, still definitely on Tales of Master Sushiro. Next up, we've got Light the Way. This is a card that just sort of like Short Circuit. It doesn't do enough often enough to really be worth a slot in your deck these days. I mean, yeah, you can sometimes use the plus and plus one counter untap effect as a trick, and then you get to trade 1 for 1. And when you line that up, okay, it's doing a thing. But most of the other stuff that it can do isn't really worth a card, and even the things that it can do, like save your creature from removal, put a counter on a thing so it wins combat, these are too situational. So it's a card that you pretty much never play in the format. I wouldn't say it's unplayable. You can play it in a catastrophe, but like a D in this format is pretty bad because the average power level of cards in the format is so high. Moonfolk Puzzle Maker. This thing's fine. It happens to be an artifact in blue, and that is good news. Its scry ability doesn't hurt. It's kind of nice to crew like a brute suit or a crew 1 vehicle with it and get to scry. But it's nothing special. Our next common is Scrapyard Steelbreaker. This card's fine if you're in especially the red-black artifact deck where, it can help. If you attack with it on a lot of boards, it's a big problem. There are definitely better ways to sacrifice creatures and set things up in that deck, but it's one that you'll run in that deck. You don't run it so much in like the blue-red artifact deck or anything, so it's definitely not worth taking early. Commune with Spirits. This is okay. I mean, I kind of feel the same way about it as I do about Light the Way or Short Circuit, where it does something, but what it does is pretty low impact and underwhelming. It does get a little better if you're splashing or something. It can help you fix a little bit because you can grab a land. If you have a bunch of enchantments, it makes the card selection better. It's probably better than Light the Way or Short Circuit, but not by a lot. Dramatist's Puppets next. This format has a bunch of counters around, so the Enter the Battlefield ability on this card actually does something. You can do stuff with sagas, but it's just so situational and low impact that I don't think I've ever seen anybody cast it against me, and I've never played it, and I think that's a pretty good indication of the kind of work that it's doing at this point. So definitely still on Tales of Master Sushiro. Reckoner's Bargain. This is another nice card if you're in the black-red deck, especially where sacrificing something gives you extra value. Gaining life, drawing cards is a pretty good payoff for doing it, but it's really only good in that deck. You don't really play it in the other ones. So our commons really weren't very good. Tales of Master Sushiro is far and away, I'd say, the best one out of the commons. I mean, the Modern Age isn't that far behind. Those two, pretty good commons. But Tales, I kind of hope we don't first pick either of them. Tales is sort of passable. But luckily, our first uncommon is a really good one. It's Replication Specialist. This has good flying stats to begin with. And then if you untap, you're usually going to be copying an artifact right away. And already that value is enough that your opponent's going to have a hard time winning the game. And if you get to do more than that, it gets insane. So it's definitely a card you feel good about first picking. It's, I had it as Blue's best uncommon. In the end, the Unspeakable Saga is probably Blue's best uncommon in the end, and Replication Specialist is second, but it's still a great uncommon you feel good about first picking. And I would definitely take it over Tales of Master Sushiro. After that, we've got Blade Blizzard Kitsune. This is another pretty good uncommon. It's not as good as Replication Specialist, and but it's still pretty good. 3 mana 2/2 with double strike is just a very good rate and limited. If you play this on turn 3 on a lot of boards, it can already just attack really effectively. The ninjutsu on it is very rarely relevant, but it is upside on a card that's already pretty good, especially once you put counters on it or you put auras on it or equipment. If you just enhance its stats in any way, it becomes a massive problem. And it's... I think I would take it over Tales of Master Sushiro, but it's pretty close between those two. Then we've got Selfless Samurai. So we have 3 very good uncommons. I mean, I guess I'd say 2 very good uncommons in the Specialist and the Samurai, and a pretty good uncommon in the Kitsune. The Samurai has been really good. If you've watched some of the draft videos on the channel or watched me stream, I've ended up with it a significant chunk of the time, and it's been an amazing card every time I've had it. And, that's kind of what one would expect going, in the set review, I gave it a B. It's definitely lived up to that. Giving life link to your attacking samurai or warrior, and then the indestructible part, which, keep in mind, the indestructible part doesn't care whether the creature's a samurai, which is really great. So it just gives you a ton of value for the mana. It's very flexible. It's powerful. That said, I think I would take Replication Specialist over it. So we've got 3 good uncommons here. Before we get to our rare, we have Replication Specialist, then Selfless Samurai. I guess I probably would take Tales of Master Sushiro over the Kitsune now, the more I think about it, and then the Kitsune. But then we have a really good rare, too. So this is an interesting pack. Our commons, pretty underwhelming, but then all 3 uncommons and our rare are all pretty good. Reckoner Bankbuster is quite good. It's not the most impressive vehicle in terms of stats or how much it costs to crew, but it makes up for all of that with its ability, which will allow you to draw cards. You eventually get a creature token and some treasure. So it's a huge value engine. It gives you like a 3 or 4 for 1 with regularity. And it's a very, very good rare. And it's what we take here in the end. So yeah, I think it goes Bankbuster, Replication Specialist, Selfless Samurai in that order. Pretty strong pack, once we got past the fairly mediocre commons. So that's what I would take there, Reckoner Bankbuster. So that'll do it for this edition of Nizzanotes. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past editions of Nizzanotes or maybe watch my set review for this format or some draft videos, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. And lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.